старое, новое политической теории, Михаил, также Панам, Никита, Боркунов, коллеги, к сожалению, наш коллега Михаил не смог по рабочей причине сегодня присутствовать, сделаем по холодным, как и сегодня в Петербурге, но пришло, уверены, надеемся, что он рад вас увидеть. Надеемся на позитивные дискуссии. У нас тематически не разделены, и сегодня мы собираемся говорить больше о читающей власти Конституции, организме, планируем много стильных докладов, с которыми, я надеюсь, уже или познакомились, или юридически, с которыми знакомитесь, но предлагаю заветов, представил несколько лет, учитывая, что это даже пару слов, а в первом случае представить, мы можем знать,
Меня нормально? Yep. Professor Verdugo, do you hear us?
Yes, I hear you.
Yeah, okay. So we are beginning our conference with your talk. I'm happy to present you Professor Verdugo from IE University, and he will give a talk on constituent power and the challenges for the digital age. I think that we will start right now. So, Professor Verdugo, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I have been told that I have 30 minutes to present. Is that correct?
You have 45 minutes. You can manage the time how you want.
Okay, I can present for 5 hours also if we can. Give me a second. I will share my presentation.
Okay.
Do you see the PPT?
Yep, we do.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. The person that contacted me, Mark, told me that the idea was to present interdisciplinary findings and how they are, from the legal perspective, because I am a legal scholar, how they can dialogue with issues of political theory. So I have been working in the past few years on two related subject matters. One of them is constitution making itself, with a more empirical focus of how constitution making takes place in countries that are trying to replace their constitutions. And the second project has to do with the normativity behind the replacement. So, and there are many theories that can be used here, but a very dominant one, I would say, in the literature is the theory of constituent power. So my question is, should we abandon the theory of constituent power? And I wrote a recent paper about this, and it's a continuing and ongoing project. And the short answer is that yes, we would be better off with other theories in all the dimensions that we are trying to answer with the question of what explains constitution making and to the question of what justifies a constitutional replacement. So that's basically my conclusion, but in the presentation I will explain how I actually get there. But first, I need to define the terms of the debate, right? What constituent power am I speaking of? And if you look at the literature today, you will see different variations of this question. Some theories use, for example, Rousseau's approach to popular sovereignty. Others use John Locke's approach to the right to rebel, for example. And there are other approaches out there that are that exist. I'm focusing on a very specific one, which I think is the most prevalent one, at least in the Western tradition, which is the one that was initiated by MSSES during the French Revolution, interpreted and changed a little bit by Carl Schmitt, and then reinterpreted in contemporary ideas as through democratic lenses. So the version of constituent power that I'm exploring now is not necessarily the version that political theories are writing about. It is rather the version that is influencing the narratives around constitution making, right? So when you see countries that are changing their constitutions, you will also see an applied debate in those jurisdictions. And those debates involve political theories, legal scholars, and sometimes judges. And they use the constituent power theory in an applied way in those jurisdictions. My focus is on Latin America, but we can see this in Bolivia, we can see this in Ecuador, we can see this in Chile, we can see it in many countries that have recently changed or tried to change their constitutions. And the theories they're drawing from usually come from this framework, right? Yes, Schmidt, and the contemporary democratic reconstruction of Schmidt's thought. Of course, scholars, intellectuals, politicians are aware that Schmidt is not presentable today, at least in many contexts, because of his Nazi credentials, right? So the idea is not to appeal to Schmidt himself, but rather to use his theory with a democratic interpretation. And it is possible to do that, right? So that's the theory they are claiming to, and the one I'm fighting against. There are other theories or corrections out there that present different alternatives and that we should be aware of. So the consequences of the constituent power theory that is linked to these authors and that is being used in actual constitution-making processes to justify those processes question the fact that whether we should follow the rules or not, right? So the first idea is of the constituent power theory is that power is an absolute. Power is unlimited. Is or should be unlimited, right? So if you agree with that, then constituent power doesn't need to follow pre-established rules, which triggers the famous paradox between the idea that we need rules in order to assess what the will of the people is, but then the will of the people can undermine those rules and go by itself, right? So this is a paradox that is very hard to solve. But in general terms, in the application of the theory, the question of whether the rules become mandatory, of course, is undermined. Second, the idea of a constitution that is illegal, or a constitution that goes against substantive commitments that could be included in procedural compromises, for example, or even in substantive norms that have been recognized historically by the jurisdictions that are enacting a constitution, right? So the constituent power theory in this version claims that the legality of the constitution is irrelevant. The question of whether the constitution is legal or not is a question that becomes meaningless, right? Because the people acting and exercising the constituent power becomes an outsider of the system. It's an external actor that doesn't abide by any rules. It's kind of creating and founding a new system, right? And this speaks to the radical nature of the theory in itself. The radical nature the theory is inherently radical because it is aimed at dismantling the institutions of the previous regime in order to found new institutions. So it's kind of a refounding, it's kind of a reboot of the system. Some constitutions don't do this, right? Some constitutions merely update institutions or make some partial reforms to what has happened before. So it could be argued that the radical nature of the theory doesn't hold every time. Nevertheless, the radical nature of the theory consists in the possibility of dismantling and renewing the political system, right? If that possibility exists, then the theory holds. It's not necessarily attached with the consequences of the process, it's more attached with the possibilities of radically dismantling everything, right? And in order to justify this radicality, the constituent power theory offers this dichotomy, these two categories that were first framed by CES during the French Revolution. We have a constituent power and we have a constituted power, right? So the constituted power operates with limited authority because it's supposed to obey the supreme power that belongs to the people and that is manifested in the Constitution. So the constituted power is bound by rules and can operate in illegal ways. But the constituent power is not bound by this, right? The constituent power operates with absolute and unlimited authority. And this entails that there is a claim to exclusivity on the legitimacy of the constitutional order. So constitutional orders are legitimate as long as they represent the will of the people. That's more or less the claim. And by making this statement, we are also claiming that other sources of legitimacy are less important or even neglected, right? So if the will of the people is the only source that matters and that can even trump other sources, then the other sources are being undermined, right? Other sources could be a minimum core for democratic principles, fundamental rights, political traditions, cultural acceptance, for example. There could be many other sources for legitimacy, but the constituent power theory claims exclusivity. So if there is a conflict among the different sources of legitimacy, the will of the people is supposed to be the one that is prevailing, right? So the constituent power theory is very radical, and it made sense, I would argue, in the case of totalitarian regimes, in the case where you can identify high levels of tyranny, right? So during the French Revolution, the advocates of the constituent power theory were trying to rebuild the state. In the end, even though at the beginning they flirted with the idea of keeping the monarchy, they decided to banish the monarchy in the end and advance a republic. So it was a very radical theory. For them, it was an instrumental theory for the goals they wanted to achieve from a normative perspective, right? So this is the theory that I claim that we should abandon. It's a bad theory, right? And it's bad because of different dimensions of the theory. So the first one is the explanatory value that it has, right? So some people use the theory, not everyone, but some contemporary interpreters use the constituent power theory to give it an explanatory value. So they claim that this theory actually explains how constitutions are being built, right? Even constitutions that do not follow the will of the people, they will always respond to an absolute and unlimited power that sometimes could operate in illegal ways, and legality is irrelevant. This explanatory dimension is wrong, right? If we look at the empirical studies of constitution making, we will see that reality is way more nuanced than that. So the explanatory value of the constituent power theory is very diminished. And I would argue that most contemporary scholars like Joel Colon Rios and various others that are writing about the constituent power theory in good terms, in terms that they agree with it, they are not looking at the explanatory dimension. Rather, they are looking at the normative dimension. And the normative dimension of the theory is a theory of legitimation, right? So you use the theory in order to claim that a constitutional order is justified, right? And this is the strongest version of the theory. And I will come back to why this idea has also problems that cannot be overcome without switching the theory by another one. Third, the third way in which the theory has been used is that as providing a blueprint for constitution making. This means that the theory is turned into a set of prescriptive rules, recommendations on how constitution making should operate, right? So the theory typically ends up in a template for constitution making. And the template consists in a representative constituent assembly that can represent actually the people, the different variations of the idea of the people. It can enact a constitution with unlimited power because it represents the people, and have that document ratified by the citizens in a post referendum, right? In an exit referendum. And there are different ideas associated to this, such as the use of majority rule, for example, to express the political equality of those who represent the people, and so on. I claim also that this blueprint is not always a good idea for actual constitution making. Okay. There have been attempts at redeeming the theory. I haven't gone through all the problems yet, but just for you to know, some contemporary scholars have tried to save it, right, from the problems. And I argue that these two scholars do one of two things. First, they change the theory in ways that make it unrecognizable, right? And in that case, then the theory does not hold. Or they make minor corrections that make the theory unworkable in non-ideal situation. And this leads us to the paradox of constitution making, right? The paradox of constitution making was first elaborated by Elster very briefly in this landmark paper, right? So Elster claimed at the end of this paper, right, after examining the American and the French constitution making processes, that constitution making, for operating in a good way, needs to achieve certain democratic conditions. However, constitution making operates or tends to take place when a crisis exists. If there's no crisis, then there's no constitution making. And the conditions that triggered the crisis are the same conditions that make the process less likely to follow a good path, right? So this is a paradox, because we need electoral institutions to be working well, on the one side, for the constitution-making process to go well, but on the other side, the same conditions that triggered the crisis are undermining the capacity of the constitution-making process to go through it. Elster doesn't develop this paradox in the context of the constituent power theory. He just makes this observation after empirically and historically assessing the French and the American constitution-making processes. But I think the paradox that he identifies has important implications for the constituent power theory, because the constituent power theory makes an assumption about the will of the people, right? The will of the people can actually be manifested. And this entails that it can be unified, it can be interpreted, it is stable, the individuals know what they want, and so on. And this is something that does not occur in practice. And that leads us to the dilemma of the constituent power redemption. This is what I call, this is the core of the paper that I wrote in 2023, which is those who defend the constituent power theory, the redeemers of the constituent power theory, need to make a choice. Either constitution making takes place in ideal conditions, right, in which representation, institutions, and electoral arrangements work well, and therefore whatever the will of the people is can be captured. Or constitution-making processes take place in a non-ideal way, right, in a context of crisis. They need to make a choice, right? If they pick the first scenario in which ideal conditions take place, then the constituent power theory should not be used in non-ideal scenarios. And because most constitution-making processes in the empirical reality take place in a context of an elevated crisis, right, we should keep the constituent power theory only as a high theoretical abstraction that should not influence the justification of the constitutional order specifically in an applied way, nor as a blueprint for constitution making. There is the possibility that the redeemers will pick the second choice, right? And they will tell you, no, we want the constituent power theory to work in non-ideal conditions. We recognize that constitution-making processes work in the context of a crisis. But if they make this choice, then they will need to explain how, in those conditions, the will of the people can be captured, represented, and form compromises with the templates that are more intuitive to the constituent power theory. And I claim that this is an impossible endeavor to use. That's why I think it is better to abandon the constituent power theory. It doesn't mean that it doesn't work in an ideal way, but we should abandon it for the context that we are discussing, right? So let me go through the criticisms first. So the first point is that the explanatory dimension of the constituent power theory does not hold empirically. Either because, as Mila Versteeg has claimed, looking at polls taken during constitution-making processes, it's very unlikely that the preferences of the citizens will actually be represented in the text, even if the text is considered by many to be good or democratic or liberal, right? An example is the death penalty in South Africa, which was recognized as banned, but a majority of the population at that time was agreed with it, right? And even if the South African process had a high level of representativity, it didn't capture whatever the will of the public opinion was, right? We could argue against this by claiming that public opinion is not the same as the will of the people. But then what is the will of the people? And what are the institutions capable to recognize them, right? Schmidt had an answer to this. Schmidt claimed that the parliaments were doing a very, very poor job at identifying the will of the people because the will of the people needed to be unified. And therefore, there was an assumption of an homogeneous society. And a leader, a strong leader in the executive power, right? The president or the chancellor that could grasp that will and give it an actual form, right? But Schmidt's version of this idea is, of course, authoritarian and is incompatible with having diverse democracies today. Right? We cannot claim that the people are the real authors of the Constitution. It just does not happen. And working in that idea in order to build a blueprint would be just wrong. There is a huge literature on how constitution making takes place, and we're rather better off looking at that literature rather than at this theory. And that's why the distinction also between the two categories, constituent power and constituted power, gets blurry. Constituent power is never unconstrained. There's always constraints. Constraints can come in different forms, of course. And then we have the normative dimension, right? So the normative dimension has been of the constituent power theory, justifying the constitutional order by claiming that the people is sovereign and we should respect the will of the people, has also been challenged with normative ideas that consider the idea of the people as an organic actor, for example, with a stable and single will of the people. This is an authoritarian approach to what the people is. We need to identify the differences. We need to respect the differences. Legality also has a value, even if a thin value. I would claim that the idea of legality is and should not be irrelevant. Because the idea of legality serves, when you have applied constitution-making processes, to lower the transaction cost in order for different sectors of society to identify overlapping agreements or consensus, if you want to use a Rawlsian approach, or they can serve to achieve compromises. And those compromises are important for the inclusivity of the process. If you treat an elected majority as representing the people in a constitution-making process, the stakes are too high, and the risks for the minority are therefore too high. And if you combine that with the unlimited power of the organs that are actually enacting the Constitution, then you will have probably not built the procedure in order to prevent an authoritarian backlash. And that's why the constituent power theory also feeds into populist narratives, right? Narratives that identify the enemy or the adversaries as not true representatives of the people. This populist narrative is, of course, very dangerous and provides a very limited approach to actually what the people is. And if we look at the empirical literature so far, we can see that that the real individuals, right, have unstable preferences. More often, they don't understand some things they vote for, right? So there are many, many problems with this. And this leads us to the need to use representative institutions in order to achieve compromises and have buy-in from different sectors of the society into the process. And that cannot be secured just by electing a very specific minority. So we need justifications that are outside of the constituent power theory. In a way, the constituent power theory becomes a content-independent theory in the sense that it doesn't matter what happens at the end. What matters is the is whether the procedure could capture the will of the people, even if the will of the people is horrible, even if the will of the people cannot be captured, even if the will of the people is deceiving because it's manipulated, or because there's just one faction that is claiming to have it in deceiving ways. And of course, this is very, very dangerous. I will explain that the Redeemers have tried to solve this problem by putting limits into the will of the people, right? And they put limits from different sources, procedures, natural rights, right? Even CES had a theory about the limitations. But when you're speaking about non-ideal scenarios, most of those limitations will just become suggestions, right? Will be part of the political debates. They will still be up for grabs, right? So those limits can work if we're discussing at the ideal level, but not at the non-ideal level. So let's let me just go a little bit just with a couple of examples. So I'm looking at Latin American cases. Latin America is many countries in Latin America have changed their constitutions many times. Constitution making has become part of ordinary politics, and the constituent power theory in the Schmidt version has actually been used in many countries, and Schmidt has been explicitly cited sometimes. If you look at constitutional law textbooks, like the text that students in law schools use, you will see the citations to CES, to Schmidt, public intellectuals will use them. So this theory is very known in Latin America. Unfortunately, the more sophisticated versions of the theory are less known. So one example comes from Venezuela, right? So Venezuela was having a crisis. There was a new incoming leader that was challenging the parties, developing an anti-party narrative, and seeking to represent the people by himself. At the beginning, Chavez presented himself as a social democrat and even a liberal, but he was not, right? After he got elected, he decided to just instrumentalize a constitution-making process in order to take control of the country and basically replace the political elites that existed at that time. The political elites that existed at that time were also very problematic. I'm not claiming that Chavez was not fighting the right enemy. I'm just claiming that his narrative of constituent power was functional in order to build the basis for the dictatorship that he would gradually build over time. After he died of cancer, his successor, Nicolás Maduro, who is still in power, has succeeded to build a fully authoritarian regime with sham elections taking place in between. So what did Chavez do? Well, they have done many times, both Chavez and Maduro. But I would refer to two specific scenarios. One of them has to do with the Constituent Assembly of 1999, in which Chavez used the idea of constituent power in order to go around the rules of the previous constitution, and had the Supreme Court at that time validating his plans. The Supreme Court put some constraints, but very minimal. In the end, Chavez got away with it. And he, by decree, regulated, had a referendum and regulated the elections of a Constituent Assembly, and regulated the rules of the electoral system in a way that could subsidize his own party. So his own political movement got around 60% of the votes, but that meant that they got almost 90% of the seats in the assembly, just because of how the electoral rules were made. And after the assembly got established, the assembly intervened into other organs, right? It was an assembly that was friendly to Chavez, so Chavez could do whatever it wanted. And it weaponized the assembly in order to nullify the opposition. And that was the beginning of the story of the path to authoritarianism in Venezuela. The second episode that I wanted to highlight happened in 2017, now with Maduro. So the opposition got got more competitive, they could organize, and they actually won the legislative elections. So for Maduro, this was a problem because the opposition could become a check from the legislative side into his power. So Maduro decided to convene another constituent assembly. And the other Constituent Assembly placed itself above all the institutions, including the judges and the new Legislative Assembly that was now controlled by opposition forces. And by doing this, the Constituent Assembly could nullify some of the acts of the Assembly, could even replace the Legislative Assembly, and could even enact laws. The 2017 Constituent Assembly did not enact a new constitution in a formal way, but it was weaponized to place itself above the institutions with the narrative of constituent power, right? If constituent power is supposed to be an outside actor of the system, where the questions of legality are irrelevant, and the will of the people is supposed to be supreme, is represented in the Constituent Assembly, then representative institutions no longer matter, right? So these are just a couple of examples. This is the assembly of Maduro. You could see how he absolutely controlled it. Later on, Maduro lost the presidential elections, and this happened last year. But he used the courts and the electoral institutions in order not to recognize the electoral results, basically confessing that Venezuela became a full closed authoritarian regime. And all of this was accompanied by the rise of social media, right? So, for example, right after the elections, the Supreme Court in Venezuela enacted a tweet, right, just saying that the elections took place well and that everything got legal. It was not a legal tool to do, but it was instrumentalized in a way to give a sense of legal legitimacy. And Maduro claimed, I am a man of the laws. I will respect the law. I will go through the courts and so on. But he had captured all the institutions and he had packed the courts before. So all of this, of course, becomes a sham. Another example comes from Ecuador, which is a later Constituent Assembly. The situation was not that different from the one in Venezuela, but it came afterwards and it used Venezuela as a blueprint, right? So Correa was a not very known politician at the time, but he decided to run through the presidential elections, and a phenomenon in social media happened, right? He became so famous in such a short time, partly because of the delegitimization of the party elites, and partly because of his use of social media. He did what Obama did in the US at that time. Obama became very famous and became very successful in using social media at that time. Correa did more or less the same, but Correa did it with a narrative that resembled what Chavez had done, right? Offering the voters that he was going to change the country, reboot the institutions, a new beginning for Ecuador, the citizens' revolution. That's how he called it, right? So after he got elected, he followed the playbook of Chavez, and he had a Constituent Assembly that was made in an illegal way, even though he battled the courts in order to have it done against the will of the parliament at that time. He even succeeded to remove many legislators from the opposition in order for his plans to be successful. And when that happened, and the Constituent Assembly that he controlled was established, Correa had the opposition complain, and they went actually to discuss the problem in the Constitutional Court. And the Congress, the legislators claim, the Constituent Assembly is not absolute, because the Constituent Assembly is a constituted power. And it's a constituted power because it's regulated by the law. And if it's regulated by the law, it doesn't really represent the people. It doesn't have sovereignty. It doesn't have supremacy. It cannot go against the rules. The Constituent Assembly cannot really control the courts and the Congress. And the argument on the other side of the Correa advocates was the opposite. The argument that the Correa advocates used resembled Chavez's idea. The Constituent Assembly is absolute, it operates in a supreme way, and they use the classical constituent power theory in order to do that. And if you could see here, the Constitutional Court had two options. The first option was to claim that the Constituent Assembly was a constituted power, and therefore it had strong limitations. That could have, raised the stakes even more by providing for more polarization between the opposition and Correa. The second option, which is the option that the court finally decided to go through, was the option to declare that the assembly was actually supreme. And it had the constituent power, and therefore all the other institutions could be even closed or dissolved if the Constituent Assembly wanted, because it was the will of the people. I claim that this is a false dilemma, right? Legislators from the opposition bought into the constituent power idea by claiming that the assembly had only constituted power. And the others also bought into the constituent power idea by claiming that the assembly had constituent power. The question was a question of interpretation. Had the assembly constituent power or not? But both agreed with the framework, the theoretical framework that the constituent power theory provides. And this was a mistake. And it's a mistake because constitution making should be approached in a more nuanced way. Constitution making should not be about completely replacing and rebooting the system, particularly in countries that already have electoral institutions in place. Constitution making should be about combining the need to reform in certain areas that are complicated and keeping the norms that are maintaining the democratic system in the long term. The constituent power theory is unable to do that. And it forces you to make an all or nothing decision, right? Either we are radical or either we keep the whole status quo. And this is wrong in a context like Ecuador and Venezuela. Both Ecuador and Venezuela had important problems. And so they needed to find a way to achieve compromises among the political elites to keep what is good for democracy and to change what was failing for democracy. The constituent power theory, by raising the stakes and having a debate that is all or nothing, prevents this from happening. That's why it's also a very bad blueprint, right? The same constituent power narrative was present also in the processes of Bolivia, and then in the process of Chile, which failed, though, for other reasons that I can go if there is time. So now we need to ask ourselves, so what are the conditions that make constitution making successful, right? What makes for a good constitution making process? And to answer this question, I have an assumption that, of course, we can discuss and not everybody can agree with, but it's a normative assumption. I assume that a good constitution is a democratic, liberal constitution, a constitution that recognizes individual rights, that has freedom of speech, that has independent institutions that can make incumbent regimes accountable, and so on. That's a good constitution. So a good constitution-making process, and I'm claiming a consequentialist argument by doing this. A good constitution-making process is a process that is more likely to produce that result, right? And why we should have a pragmatic and even consequentialist approach to this? Because the political conditions in which constitution-making processes work are non-ideal. And because they are non-ideal, representative institutions are unlikely to work well. Therefore, in the design of the process, we need to make sure to build sufficient buy-in in order to have the constitution approved and then support it, but also have a process that is more likely to trigger that outcome. And how do we do it? Constituent assemblies, like the ones I have cited, are the wrong way to do this, right? So the template that the constituent power theory is offering is also wrong. So how do we do it? We need political parties, and this is the main answer. I'm speaking about context in which we already have political parties. There is already not a one-party system, but a democratic system with political competition. We need to use them. The problem is that the parties are usually not very credible to the population, right? There is a crisis in which the representative institutions are not credible anymore, and populist narratives are rising. So how do we solve this problem? With a constitution-making process that allows the parties to get renewed, basically. Compromises among parties are important for these processes. They lower the transaction costs. They improve substantive representation in the sense that parties can lower the information costs of the voters in ways that social movements and individuals and populists cannot. right? If you vote for the socialists, you know that they have a socialist agenda. If you vote for the liberals, you know that the liberals have a liberal agenda, right? And you know that that agenda is holistic in the sense that it offers a full platform, right? If you vote, for example, for a feminist leader, right? You know that the feminist leader will care about women's rights, but you have no idea what the feminist leader will do regarding other questions for constitution making that are very, very important, such as whether we're going to have a monarch, whether we're going to have a bicameral Congress, what the electoral rules will be, what the type of constitutional court we will have, and so on. So it is better not to vote for someone that only identifies as a feminist. It's better to vote for candidates that belong to a party that offer predictable platforms, ideological platforms, right? And then we can have the parties with those holistic platforms that have substantive representation behind them, ideological representation, making compromises. And in order to do that, we need to revitalize the idea of respecting the rules. Because if the compromises are going to start at the beginning of the process to shape the continuation of the process, we need to have a procedure that punishes those politicians that deflect, right? Politicians that are only speaking to external audiences and avoiding the compromises. And the law can play a very useful function in making the process more predictable, therefore lowering the cost of achieving agreements and compromises. And unfortunately, the constituent power theory is unable to tackle any of these issues. Moreover, I would argue that the constituent power theory makes for these conditions very less likely to operate. Because by focusing on the will of the people, it's also nurturing populist narratives that posit themselves above the party system, therefore raising the stakes of the debate. Compromises among factions are important. Like the literature, the political science literature here is very, very, I would say, conclusive, right? The evidence shows that if you have constitution-making processes that are driven by competing politicians, they will check on each other and they are more likely to produce a liberal output. But if you have unilateral takeovers of the constitution-making organ, the opposite will happen. This has been measured, for example, to assess the level of independence of the judges that the assemblies are creating in their new constitutions. Also for the prosecutors, also for the emergency powers of the executive branch, right? The assemblies are more likely to establish limits to the executive power, to the executive branch exercise of emergency powers if they have check during the process. These are just some examples of this, but the logic is always the same. We should use the party system in order to have their ambitions counteracting each other, and the evidence the evidence shows that this is actually a good thing. I can speak about the regimes of the constituent power theory, but I wanted to keep a little bit of time for the questions. So I think I will end the presentation here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Verdugo, for an enlightening talk. So does the audience have any questions? Подойдите лучше сюда. Wait a second.
Yeah, Professor, thank you for your presentation and your speech. I have a question in theory of constitutional power. Have you interested in have you interested in theory of material constitution? Is a theory that became from Constantino Martito. It's Italian philosopher. It came from 1970s, and he said that we have a problem in constitutional theory that material power of society that can create some revolutionary power to create the system of political powers. It creates instability in liberal democracies, and theories, modern theories of constitutional power, are not unlike to choose a good way to speaking about constitution, because they do not offer this power. This is my question. Thanks.
I'm sorry. I'm not sure if I hear correctly. Which author from the 70s are you citing?
Господи, как его? Constantino.
Tati, the Italian.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
He is a philosopher. He is the philosopher from School of Confucius. Yeah.
Yes, I mean the theory of constituent power in the Schmittian version has received many criticisms and also alternatives. Schmitt also had his own version of what a material constitution is, right? Some people use the distinction between constitutional norms and constitutional laws, the constitution and the constitutional laws, in order to make that claim. But Mortati had a different approach. Mortati had a more dynamic approach, right? On the one side, for Schmitt, the constituent power was always present, but was always an outside actor that could manifest from time to time, right? And that makes his theory very unstable, and people like Hannah Arendt criticize that part of the theory strongly. But Mortati had a different approach, right? For Mortati, the constituent power was not a manifestation from an extraordinary actor. So his theory of the material constitution, even though it's very important, I would claim, is not the theory I am challenging now, right? And he did not make this theory in order to redeem Schmitt or Sieyès. He did his theory in order to try to explain how the Italian constitution has been changed over time. Right after the Constituent Assembly that happened after the Second World War. And that's a very valuable theory, but it's not a theory that I'm engaging with in my work, because it's not part of the classical, constituent power theory. When the constitution making processes that I have examined appeal to normative ideas, they don't appeal to Mortati, who has been influential in Italy and perhaps in other intellectual circles. There has been English work about it also. But to my knowledge, his theory hasn't really influenced a constitution-making process taking place from scratch, but rather it has been used in a more retrospective way.
Thanks. So, thank you for the answer. Any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, I will ask a question. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Professor Verdugo. It was me who spoke to you through the mail. Thank you for your presentation. I think it was very important for the Russian Academy debate on constituent power, and again, this interdisciplinary dimension of political approach and legal one. But for me, and correct me if I'm wrong, from your speech, it looks like this idea of a strong multi-party system where we could we could vote for a certain party, not for a certain person or a certain holistic program, is workable. And as you said, in the situation where strong legal and procedural institutions are already established. So, and I totally fully understand that your position comes from the legal perspective, and it is important to speak about norms and procedures. But if we speak about political orders where it's the situation with political and legal institutions, with judge independency not so good, have a legal theory has something to say about such situation, or it is a situation where lawyers goes back and political theories and political parties comes forward. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a very important question, right? So I think the more totalitarian and radical the situation is, the more revolutionary you can get, right? And the more and the less likely it is that parties will help, because either parties do not exist or parties are very, very attached to the incumbent regime, so they don't have enough incentives to make a change. And on the other extreme, you have established parties that can actually follow rules and agree and compromise, right? And the context matters a lot for what the right process should be, right? So if you are in the first scenario in which you need to get rid of a totalitarian regime and you need to and you don't have parties, at least in a competitive setting, you need to use the constitution-making process in order to build those parties, right? And you need to design a process that is more likely to end with that result. The second scenario, in which strong parties exist and they can actually agree and so on, is not feasible. It doesn't exist, right? That's an ideal scenario. The most likely scenario of the countries that I have been researching, like Iceland, for example, even Spain with the Catalonia demand, and the Latin American examples, they all speak of something in between, right? Where there is a democracy in place, there are parties that are competing among each other, but there is also corruption. There is also a strong disaffection of the citizens and the party system, and there is a rejection of the elites, right? So it's a situation that is in between. It's a flawed democratic regime, if you want to call it like that. And in that situation, I think that the parties, even though they are the bad ones of the picture, are the most likely actors to be able to gather the representation and achieve the compromises. They won't do it spontaneously. You will need to push them to do that, right? So if the stakes are high enough, they will be pushed in order to participate in the process. My argument is that we should use those parties because the alternatives are worst. The alternatives is to have a unilateral takeover from a strong populist individual, or from a specific party like a communist party, for example, that will just plan to have a one-party state, okay? If you're interested in achieving a democratic liberal result, I think the best way to do it is to do it in a way that allows rival politicians to check on each other and advance together, providing for substantive representation. And this is not enough to achieve sociological legitimacy, of course, because in that situation, the parties are not very prestigious, right? The people don't trust them. But it's a start. It's a start, right? The rest it should be not to appeal to the will of the people, because that doesn't exist, right, in this context, but to the other sources of legitimacy that are mediated by the specific political cultures. And I think that would be the best way to proceed in that scenario.
Thank you very much for the question and for the answer. So I think we are running out of time. Maybe one little question from the audience. No, there is nobody wanting to ask a question. So thank you, Professor Verdugo, for the talk. I think that your time is up, and we have a short break right now. So thank you very much for being with us. And yep, so let's hope that constituent power will be checked and will be given up on, and if no, it will be checked. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Ну, у нас получается 15